黑夜总有尽头，曙光就在前面。10月革命一声炮响，给我们送来了马克思列宁主义，走俄国人的路，这就是结论。5·4运动举起了反帝反封建的旗帜，传播了共产主义思想。1921年，伟大的中国共产党诞生了。毛泽东同志把马克思列宁主义同中国的革命实践相结合，真理的光辉照亮了中国革命的道路。
And it happened just like that. Hi, I'm Emma, and this is Communist Histories. And for the 5th entry in this series on communism in China, we're finally talking about communism. Radical politics during most of the Qing dynasty centered around a liberal reformist movement to abolish the monarchy. Socialism was unheard of. The first record we have of a Chinese writer even mentioning Karl Marx was an offhand and critical remark by Liang Qichao in 1902. Around the turn of the century, Chinese students began studying in Japan in greater numbers, which introduced them to Japanese socialists, but very few were convinced. Tongwanghui member Zhu Jixin wrote a short article on Marx in 1905, but even he lost interest shortly afterward. Scholars who knew Japanese could read plenty of Marxist theory, but by 1919, only one chapter each of the Communist Manifesto, The Origin of the Family, and Socialism, Utopian and Scientific had been translated into Chinese. Anarchism actually had a far more support in China at the time, but I'm planning a whole separate video on that, so we'll ignore it for now. The Bolshevik Revolution of November 1917 actually did not have much of an immediate effect in China. Most Chinese intellectuals knew very little about it, as for the first few years of the Russian Civil War, the parts of Russia that bordered China were controlled by the anti-communist White Armies, which weren't interested in allowing news of communist victories to pass them. And many Chinese nationalists, including the radical Chen Jiushou, were more concerned that Russian withdrawal from the First World War would lead to German victory. These nationalists were still counting on the Entente to return Germany's Chinese possessions if they won the war, and opposed anything that could threaten that victory. There was one exception. Li Dazhao was the head librarian of Beijing University, and a prominent intellectual of the New Culture movement. Li was more action-oriented than most of the New Culture reformers, and so even when he had very little concrete information about it, he became enamored with the idea of Russia's workers' government. Comparing it to the French Revolution, he wrote, "The spirit of the French of that day was the spirit of loving their country. The spirit of the Russians today is the spirit of loving man. The former was based upon nationalism, the latter tends towards internationalism. The former has always been the source of war, the latter promotes the dawn of peace." Throughout 1918, he was pretty much the sole voice in China promoting the socialist road, with little success. Then came May 4th. The betrayal of the Treaty of Versailles in May 1919, where the victorious Entente powers gave Germany's possessions to Japan rather than China, led to mass disillusionment among China's intellectuals. Wilsonian liberalism's concept of national self-determination had failed to affect policy, and the non-violence liberals had preached had only allowed the violent, self-serving warlords to take power and appease the Japanese. Even the protests and marches of the May 4th movement itself had had no long-term results. China's students were done theorizing, and they wanted to act. They just needed something to act towards. The Soviets gave this impulse an extra push with the issue of the Karakhan Manifesto in July 1919. This document officially abolished all unequal treaties between Russia and China. Now, to be clear, this did not abolish the 1858 Treaty of Arguin, which annexed 350,000 square miles of land in northeast China, and parts of the manifesto would later be renounced. But it was still a significant move of international solidarity, right when people were most angry with Western imperialism. Chen Dushou had been one of the leaders of China's student movement, and had been a spokesman along with Hu Shi of the campaign to stop talking about politics and deal only with cultural change. But after he was briefly arrested during the May 4th movement, he realized that politics couldn't wait. Still fearing rearrest and needing time to rethink his positions, Chen took about a year off from activism to think. With Chen Dushou out of the way, the radical students gravitated towards Li Dazhao as leader, as he had already been calling for political action a year before it was popular. This was far from a unanimous move, though. Liberal students coalesced around Hu Shi when he wrote a scathing attack on Li in August. Study more problems, talk less of isms. Hu was opposed to any ideology that advocated fundamental solutions. He believed that society should be changed slowly, by scientifically studying individual problems on their own. Factory conditions and women's rights should be approached separately, for example, and not treated as symptoms of some common underlying problem. Hu kept to his principle that China was not ready for political solutions. He continued to want cultural change within the current system. We don't study the standard of living of the rickshaw coolie, but rant instead about socialism. We don't study the ways in which women can be emancipated, or the family system set it right, but instead we rave about wife-sharing and free love. We don't examine the ways in which the Anfu clique might be broken up, or how the question of North and South might be resolved, but instead we rave about anarchism. And moreover, we're delighted with ourselves. We congratulate ourselves, because we are talking about fundamental solutions. Putting it bluntly, this is dream talk. Though the slaves of Confucius and Zhu Xi are fewer now, a new breed of slaves of Marx and Kropotkin has sprung up. Li responded that he was not opposed to studying problems at all, just that they had to be viewed together and solved through collective action. And the action was the real difference between them. Li felt that students needed to work. He saw that for all the successes of the new culture movement in the cities, it had led to very little change for the vast majority of Chinese people in the villages. Li tried to convince students to go to the countryside and work to improve peasants' lives. His hope was that this would awaken the masses, who could then act for their own liberation. Unfortunately, the students that actually took Li up on this made up only a small minority of radical students, which were themselves a small minority of the population. It was insufficient to affect radical change in the countryside. But it did lead to a more organized community of communist students. Li Dazhao used his head librarian status to promote Bolshevism on Beijing University's campus. He formed China's first Marxist study group, held in his office which came to be known as the Red Chamber. Some of the early attendees of the study group were Zhang Guotao, Chu Qiubai, and Mao Zedong. Mao was born in 1893 to a well-off peasant family in small-town Hunan. At 15, he defied his father's wishes and went to school. Then, during the 1911 revolution, he left school to join the army to fight the Qing. The revolution ended before his company ever saw combat, and he was dropped off in Changsha, the capital of Hunan, at 18 with no plan or direction. He briefly attended soap-making, police, law, and business schools, with no success, before he finally ended up at First Normal School, a teacher's college. Mao followed the development of the New Culture movement and was concerned with reforming China along liberal lines. He founded the New People's Study Society to help in the dissemination of liberal theories, reading philosophers such as John Spencer and Friedrich Paulsen, and he worked for the establishment of a workers' evening school. After graduating in 1918, he married the daughter of one of his professors, Yang Kaihui, then went to study at Beijing University. At Beijing U, he met Li Dazhao, who hired him as assistant librarian. Like most students, he remained a liberal until the May 4th movement. Through discussions with Li Dazhao, he became more radical. While he didn't put a label on his politics at this time, he was clearly becoming more of an anarchist. In The Great Union of the Popular Masses in July 1919, he wrote that he preferred Kropotkin to Marx. He documented strikes around the world for the Shang River Review, and wrote, "We put into practice the cry of revolution, the cry for bread, the cry for freedom, the cry for equality, the bloodless revolution. Thus we will not provoke widespread chaos, nor pursue that ineffectual revolution of bombs or revolution of blood." Mao returned to Changsha in 1920, where he became the principal of a primary school attached to his old college, and engaged in activism primarily through the Hunanese self-rule movement. By late 1920, he wrote that he was skeptical of anarchism, and declared Russia the #1 civilized country in the world. Finally, in January 1921, he referred to himself as a Marxist for the first time, and developed the New People's Study Society into a communist activist group. One thing that influenced Mao's shift to Marxism was his correspondences with his friend Tsai. Tsai went to school with Mao, and was an early member of the New People's Study Society. In 1919, he went to study in France, and came into contact with French communists. Convinced by them, he formed a communist party for Chinese people living in Europe. One person who joined this party was Zhou Enlai. Even while Marxism became a more significant force throughout China, ideologically, it was still very undeveloped. Although Marxist groups began translating more communist works in 1920, including the first full manifesto, there were still very few at the time, and people knew little about the Soviets in practice. People who described themselves as Marxists in 1920 wrote of things like the natural goodness of peasants, the possibilities of peaceful reform, or the need for an ethical dimension to Marxism. Radicals in China were inspired by the idea of the Russian Revolution, but even in 1920, few details about it were known, as most of Siberia was still controlled by white forces. The Beijing Morning Post wanted more information on it, so it hired Chu Qiubai, a translator of Russian literature, to go to Moscow as a correspondent. Chu had attended some Marxist study groups, but was only vaguely political about himself when he was hired. But what Chu saw in Moscow made him a devoted communist. His reports, and later his book, History of the Heart and the Red Capital, were the first real accounts of the Russian Revolution in China, and convinced people to look to Lenin as well as Marx. One of the first Russian representatives in China was Yang Mingjai. Yang was one of hundreds of thousands of Chinese people who had moved to Russia for work prior to World War I. During the Russian Civil War, 30 to 40,000 of these laborers, including Yang, joined the Red Army, and in 1920 Yang was sent to China as a Comintern translator. While in Shanghai, he taught Chinese radicals Russian, and helped them travel to Moscow to study at the Communist University for the Toilers of the East, where Chu Qiubai was working as a translator. Yang's Comintern partner in China, Grigory Voitinsky, headed the effort to bring China's scattered communist movement together into a unified communist party. Voitinsky and Yang arrived in China in March of 1920. They immediately sought out and met with Li Dazhao, and offered their assistance in forming a party. Li was amenable to the idea, but suggested they talk to Chen Duxiu first, who had recently returned to the national stage, pronouncing his commitment to communism. Chen also agreed, and they decided that Chen would head one branch of the party in the south, while Li headed another in the north. This was all easier said than done, though, as communists in China existed primarily in completely independent, underground cells in 1920, as most of them had grown out of study groups. And because of this decentralization, and the general lack of theoretical works in Chinese, there was little ideological consistency between them. There were almost as many anarchists and radical liberals within communist groups as there were communists, so unification also meant many divisive splits. Finally, in July 1921, with the help of another Comintern representative, Hank Sneevliet, 13 provincial representatives secretly met in Shanghai in what would be the first National Congress of the Communist Party of China. They met in the French concession to avoid Chinese police, but even the French harassed them, so they moved the meeting to a boat offshore. This boat is now a very famous symbol of the party. Attending the meeting was Mao Zedong, as a representative of the Hunan branch. Not attending the meeting were Chen Dushou and Li Dazhao, who couldn't make it. But both are still officially named as the founders of the party, with Chen elected general secretary. The representative of Beijing, Zhang Guotao, was named director of organization. These 13 delegates represented only 57 members nationwide, almost all of them intellectuals. But by the Second National Congress the next year, membership had increased to 195, although half of the 13 delegates had dropped out themselves. Chen Dushou's New Youth became an official party organ, and the party committed itself to working with the Communist International. Next time, we'll be going back a bit to establish the political background the young CCP would be working within, with the first constitutional protection movement. Like and subscribe so you don't miss it, and thanks for watching.
全世界的恶人与奴隶，我们被扰乱的理性将要沸腾呀，预备着去打死战吧。我们破坏了全世界的强权，连根地把它破坏了。我们将看见新的世界了，只要他是什么都没有的人。